Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, for another episode in the series of Cornwall podcasts, the transcripts of which will be collected together into a gazetteer for Ars Magica 5th edition. This week, King Arthur. Hunt, whose work we are following in this series of episodes, gathered his folklore in the 19th century. At this point, Cornish memories of Arthur were at low ebb. He found a few, which I'll pass on in this podcast, but for stories set in 1220, a lot of supplementary material will need to be found elsewhere. My second ever Ars Magica campaign was set in Tintagel in Cornwall, and it's the place I've reused the most. Arthur was born there, according to many versions of the story. During the game period, Arthurian stories are in high fervour. The grave of Arthur and Guinevere was miraculously discovered at Glastonbury in 1191, making that site popular for pilgrimage, which is what rich people did instead of tourism in period. The stories about Arthur are very popular. Chrétien de Troyes finished his works around 1190, and a slew of imitators and retellers are constructing the matter of Britain as the game period arrives. In 1220, King Henry III has a brother called Richard, who is 11. If game history matches real history, he becomes the Earl of Cornwall in 1225, and on his way to becoming the richest man in Europe and the Holy Roman Emperor, he buys Tintagel from the knight who owns it and builds a castle there to cement his family's links to Arthur. This must absolutely destroy the lives of Magi pulling the tame noble family charade so popular in English covenants. When Richard becomes the wealthiest guy in Europe, something he did in real life, via land taxes, banking, and owning the exclusive right to farm England's Jews, the Quaesators must come down hard on Magi who've reached an accommodation with Richard. No one gets a personal emperor, even if the title is basically honorary. These thoughts aside, let's pick apart what Hunt managed to find in the nadir of Cornish Arthuriana. There are some odd little plot hooks here, which aren't seen in more popular stories, and there's a saga seed that I really like the sound of. In the east of Cornwall, the vast rocks which, in the west, are attributed to giants are instead attributed to Arthur. He's recorded as a giant killer. In some versions, he's the reason that giants are now extinct in Cornwall. Jack the Giant Killer was the tutor to Arthur's son, and Tom Thumb was his favourite dwarf. He had various odd relatives this early in the story, including a maternal half-brother called Constantinus, who was a tyrant and the Duke of Cornwall. Hunt suggests the parish of Custenton, spelt Constantine, may be named after him. Oddly, and Hunt doesn't note this, Geoffrey of Monmouth gives Arthur's heir as a blood relative of unspecified type called Constantine. Later writers often call him Constantine, son of Cador, and suggest that he's Arthur's nephew, which requires Cador to be his half-brother, or Guinevere's brother. Hunt notes there's a family in Cornwall called Constantine who claim descent from Greek emperors through an ancestor buried in Landulph Church, and suggests they may be descended from this homegrown name. In Ars Magica, sadly, this would need to be true because the ancestor, Theodoro Paleologus, pardon to any Greeks listening, died in 1637. This may give some sort of heroic blood virtue, as might descent from the aforementioned son or any of Arthur's many bastards. The MacDermots of Ireland are all said to be his descendants, for example. Danish landing and banner fires. Hunt recounts a story where the Danes land in Grenville Cove to pillage the hamlet of Escalls. How this is possible, if the missing land we discussed a few months ago is in place, is not clear. The Cornish light a beacon fire, and the beacons burn along a route to Tintagel to tell Arthur of the threat. Time for our monthly quotation of a large block of Hunt. That night the beacon fire was lit on Chapel Hill. Another was soon blazing at Castle and Dinas, and on Tracroban. Carnbrea promptly replied and continued the signal light, which also blazed lustrously that night on St. Agnes' beacon. Presently the fires were seen on Belovely beacon, and rapidly they appeared on the great stone, on St. Bellarmine's Tor and Cadbarrow, and then the fires blazed out to Rogtor and Brownwilly. thus rapidly conveying the intelligence of war to Prince Arthur and his brave knights, who were happily assembled in full force at Tintagel to do honour to several native princes, who were at that time on a visit to the King of Cornwall. Arthur and 9 other kings, by forced marches, reached the neighbourhood of the Land's End at the end of 2 days. The Danes crossed the land, down through the bottoms to the sea on the northern side of the promontory, spreading destruction in their paths. Arthur met them on their return, and gave them battle near Vallandruchar. So terrible was the slaughter that the mill was worked with blood that day. And that ends the quote from Hunt. A holy woman also uses a miracle to call up a great storm that throws the fleeing Danish ships high up onto the rocky beaches, where Arthur and his companions massacre the Danes. Arthur and the kings then take some binding oaths with the water of St. Sennan's well, and have a feast at Table Men. Merlin makes a prophecy about how the return of the Danes will signal the day of doom, and like many of Merlin's Cornish prophecies, nothing much seems to come of it because the Danes do come back and the world doesn't end. Not all of the Danish arrivals were exterminated by Arthur. In St. Sennan, there's a community of red-headed people who do not speak the local language or interbreed with Cornish. Hunt says they might be descended from Danes, but to me that sounds like a covenant. I'd quickly like to call out some story hooks for this section before we move on. Anywhere there's been tremendous pagan bloodshed is useful for necromancers. The Danes presumably owned Caer Dinas, which literally means Castle of the Danes, so it's likely filled with Danish spirits. The mill being run with a stream of blood must somehow create an infernal aura or attract fairies for the odd bread it has made. Can you relight the beacons and call forth the ghosts of Arthur's horde or fairies pretending to be them? It seems easy to do via magic, but there's a complication. St. Agnes's beacon now has a divine aura as an act of perpetual charity by a saint. Does this make it more difficult? And of course, who has the covenant full of redheads? Just a word on Land's End, because it seems to be turning up over and over in these chapters. In Cornish, the name means the end of the land, and it's directly transliterated into English, but in Saxon it was called Penrhyn-Gard, which means headland of blood. It lies near Bolliant, which means the field of slaughter, where the Cornish and their Danish allies had their last stand against the Saxons. Arrowheads turn up there in strange profusion, which may be a vsauce. Again, necromancers love pagan battlefields. I would just like to note that in Cornish folklore, these ancient arrowheads aren't generally attributed to elves in the way they are elsewhere in the British Isles. They're thought to be what's left behind when lightning strikes the earth. So if you're a necromancer who's interested in resurrecting bodies using electricity, there could be worse places to set up a castle and hire a servant. Arthur as a chuff. Hunt is familiar with a Welsh tradition that states that Arthur took the form of a raven after his death, and so it's bad luck to kill ravens. He can't find this tradition in Cornwall, but he does find a parallel tradition which says that Arthur became a chuff. Ravens, crows, and chuffs all get tangled together a bit in the heraldry of the period. Imagine a crow, but with red beak and feet, and then mix in some folklore that indicates this colour is due to the violent death of Arthur, and you have a chuff. I absolutely love the idea that Arthur is now like one of those Iorna Magi who become a terrible Titanic version of their heart beast, and that he leads a circle of knights that take the form of ravens or chuffs or crows. Are these part of House Bajorna, or are they a little fragment tradition in Ex Miscellanea? Are they omen-bearing Marinitas or courtly Yarburton Magi? Can they keep their kit when they change shape, like some fairies? What does this strike force want? What does it do? Are they guided by the prophecies of Merlin, slightly less rubbish ones, to prevent some great calamity that would force Arthur to return? Arthur's death and grave sites. Hunt mentions an inscribed rock marking Arthur's death site at Slaughter-Bridge. Interestingly, that's the only bit of Cornwall I've been to. Linda and I visited Cornwall, accidentally, when we were trying to drive from Stonehenge to Bath. I had the map upside down. Saw Slaughter-Bridge, said, sorry, I seem to have led us to Cornwall. Hunt, back to the subject at hand, also mentions Arthur dying at Camelford and then being buried at Glastonbury. He then quotes Bale's Acts of the English Votaries, so brace yourself for some of that. In Avalon, anno 1191, there found they the flesh both of Arthur and of his wife Guinevere, turned all to dust, within their combs of strong oak, the bones only remaining. A monk of the same abbey, standing and beholding the fine braidings of the woman's hair, as yellow as gold there still to remain, as a man ravished, or more than half from his wits, he leaped into the grave 15 feet deep, to have caught them suddenly. But he failed of his purpose, for so soon as they were touched, they fell all to powder. And that ends that quotation. Hunt also leaves two tendrils for me to pad out later. He mentions Sir Tristram, who was the Prince of Lyonesse, was born at Carlion at Key, and that Damalok Castle was where Golothus of the Purple Spear, called Galorus in the Pendragon role-playing game, which is excellent, was besieged by Uther's army while the High King was off creating Arthur with the help of enchantment. I've not heard the Purple Spear epithet for Galorus before. Presumably it relates to blood. I think I'm going to leave that comment there. See you next week for some more Dunsany.